Just one more point of failure I got to check to make sure. When I'm messing with one thing, I unplug another thing. So it's got to keep me on my feet. Okay, so we're in the book of Ephesians. We've been going through this in a series of textual, trying to study it, and we're coming towards the end of it. And so, just briefly, without going all the way back through it again, the first part of this book was what I call kind of the theory, kind of looking at the actual scheme of redemption, the way that God had fulfilled everything through Christ, how that it was mysterious before, but now has been revealed. And again, everything through Christ. He describes our relationship with Christ as an equal heir, not subjugated, but we have this sense of an equality with him. And all of that is in Christ. And so it goes through and then shifts Paul in looking at the practical side. Like I always say, it's easy to teach a class, but it's hard to go out and do it. And so that's one of the things that you find like in the differences between like vocational schooling versus university. Vocational schooling, you'll have a period of classroom where you learn the theory, and then what do? You have a lab. Now, not that all universities don't have, biology, I had a biology lab. Chemistry, we had a chemistry lab where we went and did. But the vocational side is you learn about welding, you learn the theory of the rods and the temperature and the different types of equipment, and then you go out and you weld. You start doing it. And that's what we see here with this book, is it shows us the practical side of the theory and confirms our faith, all in Christ, and then how we should be progressing. But then it says, how do we work with each other? And it points towards ourselves and our relationship. And he's talking about Christians. He's not talking about the world. And we know that as a group of Christians, we come from diverse backgrounds and we have different beliefs that we grew up with. And that can be troublesome at times in how we deal with each other. And the sad part is, honestly, some of the worst behavior I've seen among people is between Christians. It sounds horrible, but it's sadly the truth, where sometimes it's a fellow brother or sister in Christ that has actually done more damage than somebody that's out in the world. And so when we look at this, we need to remember we have to be able to take our faith and put it into action. And the focus we looked at last week, and he's starting about relationships, because that's what it's all about, at least while we're on this earth. We have to learn to get along and function in a spiritual way, not the way the world does. Because one of the things that the glory of God is demonstrated through is the church. And then Paul talked about last week, looking at how that it is also the marriage. There's a reflection of what? The church. And that's what he talks about. Now, like I said, a lot of times we start talking about relationships in a godly manner, the way that God has prescribed, we offend all those who want to do it their way. And I just keep asking them, how's that working? Honestly, how's that working? We just went through and are still in this great social experiment of what you think you are, who you really are, what you want society to say you are, what you define a certain way of relationships are, and what's healthy and what's not healthy in relationships, and how we should do all. And I just, again, how's that working out? Honestly, it's not good. Our education system is terrible. We have more violence than we've ever seen before. And it all comes back to, honestly, it starts with the family. We are the nucleus that starts a society, that starts a neighborhood. And if you got a neighborhood, you got a society that's a bunch of broke, selfish, sinful people. Guess what you get when you come to a community? And then guess what you get when you come to a state, a nation? It's the same. And it has to start somewhere. And this is where, when we look at this relationships that God has established, it's for our benefit. It's not to somehow minimize the inequality of one created person over another. Equality is there. Male and female are equal. our roles are different. And some of them require somebody has to be submissive to somebody. And that's what he talks about when it comes to the marriage. Now, you can argue with God all day long why he put man in charge, because you know he can't follow instructions, and you can sit and running down and beat up on men. But you know what? God put man in charge of the family. Didn't do it because we're the smartest. Trust me. I know a lot of wives, and they're a lot smarter than their husbands. Not mine, of course. No, yes, she is. So why do we go there? What takes us down there? I'll tell you why. Pride. Pride wants us to flare up and go, well, I'm just as good as my husband. And the husband going, well, my wife isn't as good as me. And that's sinful. That's the problem, isn't it? Instead of understanding there is a beauty in the relationship as God has designed, and there's a peace and prosperity that will come through that without either one, husband or wife, belittling the other one. That's something that we need to hold on to and understand. And then in this passage we looked at last week, he said, because this is the way that it is modeled with Christ as the head of the church, the husband as head of the wife, the family. And so he says, this is a great mystery. And it's like, what's the great mystery? Their marriage has been forever. What's the great mystery? There's one mystery he mentioned earlier, and it was in reference to the Gentiles and all of the races of people coming into one kingdom together in equality. That was a great mystery. But this one, like, marriage has been around since Adam and Eve. What's the mystery? Well, the mystery is that God shadowed it as the church. In other words, he established it, and a part of establishing it, male and female, and that they become one, that was going to be symbolic of that relationship in the marriage, that's the way it is with the church. Just as the Son is subject to the Father. Now think about that. He's God, right? And we know how submissive he was to the Father, how much he had yielded to the Father himself. You could say, and even, it says, he did not see it robbery. He did not see it as insulting to claim that he was God himself. But you never saw him go, well, I'm just as good as you, Father God. I'm Son God. I'm just as good. No, he submitted himself. And in that brings beauty. And that's what he's reflecting and saying, just as the Son is the head of the church, that we as husbands are head of our families, and the body, being the church, was the wife. And what did he do for the church? The Son. He gave her everything. He gave everything to the church. His love, everything. So husbands, guess what? That's what we're to do. In the same way, the church is to be submissive to what? The head of Christ. And that's where it's kind of interesting that, when an individual is rebellious, a church, they rebel. They're rebelling against the head. They're rebelling against God. When they teach false doctrines, when they're not following after the gospel message, they're in rebellion. It's same parallel. So that starts with the head, because I'll tell you what, if you got a dysfunctional marriage and you have children, it's going to be dysfunctional children. If you are broken in a marriage, it's going to flow downhill to your children, because they're like little sponges. I just always remember watching, like when little kids on a baseball field somewhere. I'm talking like 3 years old, where they've just learned to walk, or maybe 5 years old. And I remember this one had a swagger walk just like his dad, walking beside him. And I was like, oh my goodness, look at that. He's got that walk just like his daddy. Where'd he get that from? Do you think he went, well, I'm going to walk like my dad? No. They're little sponges. And so now and then, when we hear them using certain language, you go, well, I guess they must have got their update on vulgarity weekly. No, they got it from their dad and their mom, didn't they? So the things that we're seeing reflected in the schools, in the society today, guess where it's coming from? The violence that we're witnessing in this city alone by youth killing themselves. It starts at home. It starts with the mother and the father. And so that's why it's logical for him to start with the marriage relationship and the power of that relationship. And so this week we're continuing it. It seems like it gets a little bit off, but whenever we talk about bondservants, we'll get to that. But when he talks about children, now he says fathers, and I think it's kind of fitting, but he's talking about parents. But let's do verses 1 through 3. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Honor. You know, sometimes children try to make it conditional. And again, you know, if a marriage is spiritually focused, I'm not saying perfect. You're never going to get a perfect marriage. You know, there's going to be some strife in between the husband and the wife. And they need to see that, because there's a level of that that's healthy, that they need to witness that your parents aren't perfect. And they need to see that. But there's a difference when you start seeing a total disrespect for the mother by the father, or abuse, or a total rebellion by the wife in disrespecting the father in front of them. Now, it's one thing, and this is something that, you know, I tried to do, and, you know, me and Suzanne was like, you know what, if we got some knockout, drag out problem between us, let's go behind the door and close it and let's get it out. But we don't do it in front of the kids. That's something that we need to work out. And we respected each other, and we tried that. You know, I mean, that, not saying I ever mastered it. Please don't look at me as being the model teacher for parenthood. No. But you know what? It made a difference. No matter what I can say, good or bad or indifferent, my boys are good, moral men. Made some dumb choices, I might say, you know, don't agree with some of the stuff, but, you know, it's the way that we start that road. But it starts by the children learning honor between the mother and the father, that they then will give you the honor. And sometimes as a child, it's hard to honor your mother and father, isn't it? There are some kids that I don't know how they survive their parents, right? You just really wonder, you know, you kind of look at, you know, the family environment in which they were raised, and you go, whoa, how in the world did that one child make it out of such a horrible family? And they do. But that's not the norm. The norm is not that. But that honor has to also be demonstrated from the mother and the father, and model it for your children. And they again, they're like that sponge, man. If they see that happening with the mother and the father, you know what they instinctively just naturally do? Is they give you that honor. They will honor it. But sometimes, children, you have to be reminded, honor your mother and father. There's going to be a lot of times that you're never going to agree with them, especially when you hit your teenage years. There's something that happens to your parents' intelligence that seems to just go down the toilet. They get really dumb when you become a teenager. There's some reason that all of a sudden, you know, you go to school and you're learning stuff and you realize that your dad's got a 4th grade education and picked cotton, and I went to college, and so I'm smarter than my truck driver dad. And I thought that for a while until I got a little older and realized I'm not as smart as the 4th grader, my father. And so I did. We tend to go back, and we will push back. And there were just some things that I had to learn, that I need to honor my father. Just honor him. Whether I agree with him or not, overall, first off, God tells us to. If you want to just stop the sermon right there, God says to honor him. And he doesn't make it conditional. He doesn't say, well, if they're Christians, honor them. If they're this, honor them. He says, honor them. It's just like with the office of the presidency all my life. I've honored that office. I don't like some of the people that have occupied it, But I have always been enthralled by the office of the presidency and the White House and all that's around it. And some of the people have come through there and realizing, and I honor it. And I give that office of the presidency the honor. And if there's somebody in there, you know what? I give them the honor, whether I voted for them or not. Doesn't sound current, does it? Sounds like I'm old-fashioned, because that's not what's happening. Our society can't even do that, no matter what party you're in. You know, it seems like we can't give honor because we don't like somebody. It's not about like, again. You don't have to like your parents either, kids. But you got to honor them. What does that mean? It means listen to them. Consider what they're saying. Yield to them. Whether you like it or not, they've lived a few more years than you have. They have seen a lot of failures more than you have. They have lived through the time period that you're going through that you now think you're smarter than they are. They have been in the act of rebellion themselves as a child, and they know what it could get you. Now, so that's a challenge in some families, even in some so-called Christian families. But look what he also says, something very important. He says, and this is actually comes right out of Exodus 20, verse 12. And it's kind of interesting because Paul says it's the first commandment with a promise. So what are the commandments? The 10 commandments. Think about that. All the commandments that he gave, it's the one with a promise. The other ones are just, you better do this. You shall not kill. You shall not have gods before me. You shall not, shall not. Now, they all have some promises, like if you follow God, and the Jews, they would be blessed by the things in which God would provide them. But it's interesting how specific that even God, through Moses, brought a promise. Maybe we need to remember that. Now, it's not going to give you 10 more years of life. That's not what he's saying. He's not going to say that you're going to live beyond the national average because you were honoring your parents. But there's a lot of things that it is a proven, and I even did the research this last week, and I pulled up Psychology Today, different research studies when it comes to children, and I could have gone through all those, and I thought, nah, that's too much. But it's not just biblical, in other words. There's not just a Bible thing. Oh, there's those religious people telling children to honor their kids, and so it'll be good for them the rest of their lives. Wrong. It's actually supported by worldly studies. That when you have children who are obeying their parents, now it's not saying, again, it's not reflecting, it's just saying that relationship, first off, has a peace in there. There's a part where every one of us are subject to somebody. And by that, we learn that in those relationships. And that's something that is learned even in a mother and a father. When they learn that the mother is submissive, and in order to the father, the head, the child learns how to be submissive. They don't learn how to be submissive in a rebellious marital relationship. You know what they learn? Rebellion. And that's a psychological today. You can go use your AI chat, whatever you want. That's a worldly proof that children model. And some of the things they get, two of the key things that they get is they learn how to be submissive and not in rebellion. In society, more children are in jail that have had no father or a functional family than one that had a two-parent relationship. That's a fact. The prison systems have studied it. Psychologists have studied it. Most of the people in prison come from families where there's one parent, a broken family. And so, yes, they learn how to be more functional in society, how to listen to the government, how to listen to and obey the laws of the land. Even though you disagree with the speed limit, you might think it should be 55 when it's only 25. You know what? There's a reason somebody smarter did that study. And so we take it upon ourselves. Well, I can do 55 through here safely, and then you hit a kid. Why do you think they established that? And that's what we learn, is that we don't sit there and rebel against every little thing that seems to restrict our ability to live our lives the way we want. We learn that there's more peace and harmony by following. And that's what we learn as a child, by learning to be obedient. The other thing it learns is the social connectivity, the ability to interact socially. Even in a conversation, somebody's got to shut up and listen. Somebody's got to yield, right? You ever had a conversation with somebody that don't listen to anything you're saying? They just keep talking over you and blah, 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 blah. Or you have an idea that differs from them and they just bicker back at you? That's somebody who doesn't know how to yield. Where do you think they learn that? Their mother and father. When a father doesn't honor the mother and listen to her occasionally, and each of them working, a little child looks and sees a father, even though he may be the head of the household, honoring his mother and listening to her and saying, well, let's don't go to the pizza place. Instead of the father real yielding up and go, well, we're going to the pizza place, What is the child learning? So that helps him in his social interactions with friends and creating friends and being able to work with others that are different from him. That whenever he's at school or in a workplace and somebody has something really silly that they think, they respect what that person may say in spite of what they might personally believe. And that wins a whole lot more friends and social functioning than the other, which brings more dysfunction in that personal life. So you see where it starts to make a miserable person? I really do see it. We have a generation of children that are miserable. And they're seeking out some sort of peace and happiness in all the wrong places. And they yearn to satisfy it. And they're satisfying it in all the wrong ways. Because that's what they learned at home. And that's why it's a part of this blessing that he says will lengthen your days. Now, how does it lengthen it? Well, one, I'm not going to go to prison and get shanked. Right? My probability of going to prison, one, is cut down by having this family that was modeled after God's image, where a father was the head, the mother was submissive, and the children were obedient. My probability are cut way over half that I won't go and probably get stomped to death or hurt in prison. That's one thing that kind of does extend your life. The other thing is that I won't rebel against the law. That I won't be driving 55 in a 25 and a kid jump out in front of me. Why? Because I was listening to the law. I was submissive. I learned how to adjust and respect, whether I agreed with the law or not. I learned not to drink and drive because I know what's going to happen. The people in my car, I could roll over and flip and kill them in my car, or I might get killed or kill others in another vehicle. So my days will be lengthened, right? There's a lot of things about this. And then if we boil down to, I call it the emotional trauma that the world without God lives in, that they don't even realize it. It's like in World War II, those veterans who never had a discharge date, you know what their date was? End of war plus 45 days. Now that, during Vietnam, Korea, the soldiers had a date. They marked it on the calendar. We used to sing a jody about counting down the days that we knew we were going to get out. But in World War II, those guys lived a duration of the war plus, I think it was 40 days. They didn't know what it was like to not know they're going to die. They lived continually in that, and it affected them to a core level, and it affected them the rest of their lives. And so what we find is we see that this type of stimulus and stress that the body endures through the spiritual experiences where we're going around us breaks our bodies down physically. That's a proven fact. Fantastic book, funny book, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's amazing. And basically, when a zebra goes to the watering hole and a lion chases it and it barely makes it out, and it uses all the endorphins and all that to run away and get away, and the fright of it that saved it because it was able to outrun the lion, it goes and lays under a tree and rests. You know what it doesn't do? It doesn't keep thinking about the chase of the lion. It can let it go. But you know what humans do? We are the only animal, if you want to speak of it in that sense, they have shown we can sit and think about something and remimic the entire emotional endocrine stimulus as if we are being chased by that lion. The same hormones, everything affects us. You know what those stress hormones do to your body? First off, it's called fight or flight. So what happens is your body says, you know what? I have to live. And so everything that's non-essential in your body to live right now, to outrun the lion, it stops and puts all of its energy into survival mode. And you know what that means? Your immune system gets shut down. You don't need to worry about not getting smallpox or getting in sort of fighting infection because you're going to be dead eaten by a lion. You better run faster. So the body knows. It shuts down things that are non-essential. So if you're living under stress and all of this, your health, it's shown. You shorten your life. So if you want to get biological and non-spiritual, there's the facts right there alone. So when we read this about prolonging your days, you're going to be healthier, happier, and you will probably live longer than those who are out there being just eaten alive with the stress that impacts their body. So God knows something when he says about it will prolong our lives as children. Think about that. Because that's one thing children are about. It's like, I want to live forever. Well, it starts with the simple fact of just honoring your parents. He says in everything, obey, right? Obey him in everything. He says, children, obey your parents in everything. In Colossians 3:20 and 21, he says, for this pleases the Lord. So rebellion does not. Fathers, don't provoke your children lest they become discouraged. This is echoed exactly what he says, what we're in the text here in the next verse of fathers. Fathers, that is so important. Just because you're large and in charge does not mean that you're doing it right. Doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean you have absolute wisdom and power, and therefore you can wield it the way you want. If anything, it's the other way around. You need to have the wisdom and understanding. I have that power. I don't need to announce it, beat somebody over the head, especially my children. And that's hard when you're struggling. And this is why the house that's following after the Lord and striving in God will be far more successful. And especially as the head of the house, guiding your family, respecting your wife and giving her the equality of her creative position, but yet her role may be a little different. But it does not mean that you belittle her. Your children are going to see this. You need to do the same with your children. There's a certain level to where as well that it's just not your authority you throw upon your children and demand it. There is a part where you got to teach them. But there's also a point where you just say, I've already said it. I don't know how many times. There's a part where instead of going from just saying, do it, I said so, to trying to explain everything about it. Well, it's a healthy thing because ants will crawl into your room and then you'll get this bacteria that will grow and eventually it'll get onto your skin and it'll penetrate through your skin and you'll get sick and you could possibly have to have there's a balance, but there needs to be a conversation. You need to be able to have a discussion because you want your child as they're growing to be able to come to you and ask dumb questions. If you're always beating them up and locking them down, they won't approach you. They won't come to you and talk to you. And so that's the part where, yes, don't provoke them because they're already not understanding and they don't have the same knowledge as you. So it's easy to cause them to shut down. That's what happens to grown adults, doesn't it? Whenever you talk to them and you say you insult them or you disregard their opinions and ideas, it provokes people. And what does it do? It breaks down the layer of communication. And so that's what we don't want to do. We don't want to force a child into where they just become so frustrated that they become angry. Now, you're never going to prevent a child from getting angry. But that's not the point. The point is the overall relationship that you have. But what does he say in Ephesians? Bring them up in the discipline and instruction of Dr. Phil. Oh, got you to look up. I'm not saying Dr. Phil's bad. I know I threw that name out there, but you know, how many books have been written? Dr. Spock, does anybody remember that book? No, not the Star Trek Dr. Spock. I got some of you. You Trekkies are sitting there going, oh, he wrote a book on raising children? No. There was another Dr. Spock who, I believe it was in the early 60s, wrote a book about parenting. It was horrible. It was the opposite. And it just created more dysfunction in families than understanding. Raise them up. Discipline. Discipline doesn't mean whoopings. It doesn't mean punishment. Alone, it does not mean that. What it means is teach them. Instruct them. That's what discipline. Discipline is training. Now, it may require the rod. It may require some suffering, because guess what? When you make mistakes in life, there are what we call consequences. And you can't butter them up. You can't stuff them under a rug. There are consequences, good and bad. And then you cannot change that in life. And that's what a child needs to learn. Every child needs to learn consequences of behavior and responsibility for that behavior. And learning how to pull through. That's the really challenge, is teaching a child how to pull through a consequence that is negative. They made a mistake, and now they're feeling the punishment for it. Instead of ridiculing them, maybe you've taught them that, and they still made the wrong choice, and they have consequences. You love them through it. And you're praying that they learn from that consequence, and you're their guide on both sides of that journey. And you're helping them. And that's that development that you're going to do even when you're old. I still see myself, even as a parent of grown men, that they talk to me. We have that relationship, I feel, and sometimes I just tell them, I'm sorry, son, that's dumb. But you're your own man. But I'm just sharing, that's what I think. And sometimes they'll listen, and a lot of times they do what they want anyway. That's okay. But you know what? They talk to me. They talk to me. I know they don't tell me everything. But what's it in? It's in the Lord. That's the scripture. And that's bringing them to Bible studies. It's teaching them the precepts through your example. That's the strongest lesson. Is that how are you acting will reflect what you really believe when it comes to God's word. And you need to show them that you pray. You need to show them that you value coming and being with other Christians and that relationship, that they can tell a difference between you and the parents that are living ungodly out there. They need to see that example. They need to read the Bible with you. You need to help explain some of those concepts to them as they're going along. And first it starts out with maybe simple children's stories. But eventually your son's going to go, was that really a whale or a big fish that Jonah got swallowed by? Now we can have a good conversation, right? And that's what I've seen is so cool, is that it started out like that with my boys, and then all of a sudden it started getting into stuff that's like going over my head. And I'm like, whoa! I'm like, okay, you're way beyond me now. It's awesome. And whether it's in that or other aspects in life, you will find the joy of watching your child explode in wisdom to where sometimes you're going to go, like my oldest son, man, if there's something I want to find out about a product or do any research, I just call him and say, hey, could you find out about this and see what's the right thing? And oh my, does he come back with all this information and all this stuff? And it's like, and he's always right. There's a lot of other stuff he might be wrong on, but he's excelled. Isn't that what we want? We want to. That's why fathers, don't beat down your children. And I've heard it, and I use this a lot. I pick on Tommy McDaniel. I love the man. He was like a father to me, and he saw me struggling with my little boys in this building here. Saw how they were, that they were full of life, spirit, spit, and vinegar, and sometimes it was a wrestling match just to kind of get them going in life. And I remember him one day I don't know, it wasn't even in a conversation about children, but he just stopped and he looked at me and he said, Ron, it's tough raising boys. And he raised a bunch, didn't he? He raised a bunch of kids. And he saw it. And I learned, you know what? He's got some wisdom, whether he got it right or not, I don't know. But see, you start learning to listen. And one of the things he said is, you can beat the spirit out of a boy, but you can't put it back. You know what I learned? Basically was talking about this verse in application, that I should not provoke them. I should not do that to them because I can end up crushing their spirit as well. And so it is something that parents need to think about. The Proverbs 19:18 says, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. Crushing. Now, I don't think the Proverbs writer is really talking about a physical death. I think he's talking about crushing them spiritually to where they will end up being spiritually dead when it comes to that. And this is one that used to always get thrown on me, even as a parent. Train up the way of a child that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart of it. And I'm going to tell you, this is a proverb, parents, because every child at some point, no matter how well you raise them, 90% of them that are even raised in the church are going to go away. They're going to walk. I saw my grandparents and his children. He had 6 children. 1 died, and all 5 of them at some point in their lives walked away and never went to church again. And then let's say again. But you know what? When they were in their 40s, in their 50s, they started coming back to the Lord. But my grandparents had died and missed that return. And it broke my grandfather's heart because he thought he had lost his children. He didn't. He had trained them up in the way of the Lord. But you know what? Free will is that they get to choose too. But if you put that in them, you plant that in their hearts, that's the way in which you will find they will go. That will be their moral boundary, that they may go to the left a little bit, but you know what? They'll come back. And it's always going to be in there. And that's something that we need to remember. They won't depart too far. And that's what it'll do. So we need to think about that as we're looking at them. Now, the next one, he talks about bondservants, and we wonder, well, how does that relate? Remember, marriage, husband, wife, about being submissive. Each of us have a submissive role. Children, father, submissive. You know why? Because we're naturally, unfortunately, our flesh is rebellious. And so that's the thread that connects these together when we look at them. And so what does he say? He says, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. So now, we don't have that type of relationship, and every time we think of bondservant, slave stuff, we automatically go to slavery of America, and it was horrible. This is not the model. This is not what he's talking about. You go back to the first century, how did people survive? What was their relationships? Well, some had agricultural farms and they could raise, they had animals they would raise and things like this. Some didn't have that ability. So they would go into service to others and commit themselves to service. So this is the overall concept, was this bond to a servant. One who would bind themselves to a family and then be indebted to that person, and that master would provide for that person. Now, some of those relationships were dynamic. It's not just singular, one fits all. Some of them became bondservants because of prisoners of war. Some of them became bondservants because of economical distress, debt. something happened and they become so indebted that the only way they can get out of that debt was to then go into work for another person and submit themselves to that other person. So these are the relationships. There's many others that kind of come about by that. Now, also, when we study it in the Mosaic Law, there were very strict regulations on that relationship. It wasn't just the type of civil war, pre-civil war relationship. The master had to respect and had to treat and take care of that servant. The Romans had servants like that. And today, again, we hear that word slave and automatically are repulsed because of our history of slavery. But you need to kind of think of it a little more broader as a relationship when it comes to somebody you're working for, somebody that you're trying to gain and have being provided from them. They're going to give you something, provide for you. And mostly, it's called a job. It's called a career. But you don't call your boss your bondservant. Well, I've had some that do. Some I felt like they're my master. They treat me maybe that way. But I am, in a sense, obligated to follow them and be able to then receive what? Things in which I can take care of my family for. And so this is the application in general that I believe he's talking about. Because again, we're talking about that interpersonal relationship with others, right? And how we respond. And submissiveness is always a requirement in some level. You're always going to be in charge. You're always going to be chief or Indian. Remember that saying? We all can't be chiefs, right? Someone's got to be the Indians. We used to play that game. It's a fundamental nature. We know that. So what does he say? He says, with a sincere heart. Do it genuine. And do it as what? As you're serving him. Not him, your boss, but serving him. That's huge when you start to think about who's watching you on the job. Who's watching you as you're interacting and you're showing respect or lack of respect to the authority where you work. And by the way, if you keep rebelling, you're going to be unemployed anyway, and you're going to be dysfunctional. But he's watching that, and you're not doing it for him. You're doing it because of him. And that's what pleases the Lord. That's what he is saying there. He says that's what we're doing. We're doing it as Christ, and we're doing it from the heart. We're not doing it out of compulsion, because people will see that. I've seen employees that are amazing employees because they respect their bosses. Even if they disagree, they may not respect with their politics or their morality, but you know what? They respect their bosses. And guess where they learned that from? Oh yeah, he just talked about that as a child, right? We start to learn how to be functional in submissive relationships when we're a child. So why is the workplace so dysfunctional today? Rolls back around again. What type of generation are we raising? One that is selfish and rebellious. And so they go to work, and guess what? They disrespect their bosses, and they go through jobs all the time. They're not willing to submit. It gives order versus chaos. Satan wants the chaos. And so we're not doing it as if we're trying to serve a man, but we're doing it because we're doing it in service to God, as he says. And he says, we will be rewarded there at the last. Look at that. The Lord knows. You might get a paycheck from your boss, but you're going to get something much better and more precious from the Lord himself. He knows. And this is what Peter echoes in 1 Peter chapter 2:17. He says, honor everyone. Notice that? Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respects. Do not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. You notice, he says, honor everyone. He doesn't say, the murderer, you can cut them out of your list. The adulterer, don't honor them. The gang member, don't honor them. He's not saying give them a place of respect in society, but it's a way of humility of ourselves to keep us from judging all these other different people that we think are so immoral. But look what he says. This one hits home dearly today. Honor the emperor. Do you know who the emperor was? That he's telling them to honor? One of the most insane, evil, Christian, burning, murdering emperor there was, Nero. He said, honor him. If there would ever be a person in authority or rule that you would say, don't follow him, you can rebel against him, it would be that repulsive, disgusting Nero. And yet we can't do that for whoever is the president, right? Hit home? And I'm not talking which party. I'm talking regardless. I'm talking about whoever is in that office. You may call him a Nero, but you know what? There's a level that you give them respect. That's what God is saying. Because whether we like it or not, Paul will teach later, or not later, but he teaches through Romans and other places that God is dealing with them, okay? Let God deal with them. And by the way, he did. Took Nero out. Committed suicide. You look at all of them. God's taking care of them. But your role is to give them that level of honor. Doesn't mean you follow them in everything they say if it's ungodly against it. That's not what he's saying. But there's a level that we have to do this. And so you do that as well with them. And so then he turns to the masters or your bosses. And everybody here is at some point possibly or probably had somebody that they supervised. And so they have a role too. And this fits in with the old law. He says, do the same to them. In other words, it goes both ways. You need to honor those who are under you. You need to respect them. You got to have that same, just like the husband and the wife, the master and the slave, the boss and the employee. He says, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So if you don't like who's in charge of you, whether it's your boss or the leader of your nation, just remember, God's their master too. And like Paul said, he'll deal with them. He'll deal with them. And he says to masters, over going back and dealing with what I said about the old law, how he talked about master relationships, and he has a lot of regulations on how to treat them. And one of the ones I extract here is, you shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. You treat them the way you would want to be treated. They may be under you, but you treat them the way you want to be treated. And so these are hard lessons for us to take in when it comes to our relationships. But I guarantee you, the peace and prosperity and the everlasting life that you gain from it is a blessing beyond our understanding. And that is the power of this book of Ephesians. And how by taking in this, making it a real faith, not just theory, how beautiful and powerful you can live your life. This morning, if there's somebody with us that we can help you in your relationship, whether it's to establish and become a Christian, the way that we see that the apostles instructed, that when people ask that question, what did they say? Repent and be baptized, each one of you, for forgiveness of sin. That was the key step. That's all you need to do. You believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? You do well. But you know what else James says? The demons do too. But you need to go more. So he says that. If you're one that has already become a child of God, then we need to turn back. You need to accept the fact that we have wronged him, confess our sins to him, not to man. And he is faithful to forgive you every time, John says. Anything else that we can do to help you in that relationship, if you're comfortable, you can come forward. Think about this song and how it relates to you. And if you need to, take action while we can. Let us sing.